review of First Chronicles. First Chronicles is the first half of the broader Chronicle books. The book of Second Chronicles continues the history line of Israel that we see introduced in First Chronicles. First Chronicles is a historical book of the Bible found between First and Second Kings and Ezra. The order of this book fits the historical timeline since the events of Ezra and Nehemiah follow what occurs in First and Second Chronicles. There's a great amount of material in First Chronicles that overlays First and Second Kings. In fact, 50% of both First and Second Chronicles is the same material as found in the book of Samuel and the books of the Kings. First and Second Chronicles supplement much of the material that we find in Samuel and Kings, so it's a great resource to reference the other books as you read through this one. The Hebrew title for the book means the affairs of the day, or daily matters, which is to be understood as annals or chronicles. This title is important because it points to what the book is about. It's the affairs of the kings. The author of the book of Chronicles is anonymous. There's no indication in Scripture that point to a specific author, other than that the divine author is God. There are suggestions that Ezra wrote it, but that can't be confirmed. The time frame for First and Second Chronicles covers from Adam to Cyrus' decree in 538 BC, releasing Israel from exile. It covers a longer time frame than any other of the historical books in the Old Testament. The date of the writing is believed to be in the early 400s BC. First Chronicles concerns itself with the progress of God's kingdom as it was initially represented by the Davidic kingdom in Israel and later by Judah. Something to notice is the theological importance of David's dynasty and worship in the temple. In chapter 17, we see the covenant that God made with David that one of his descendants would sit on the throne forever, a reference to the future when King Jesus will sit on that throne. As you read this book, you will notice that it was written as a narrative because it is relating the history of the Davidic dynasty. The two books of Chronicles shows a pathway of God's outworking of his promises to his people and the way he positions Judah to be the conduit that he will use to accomplish his promises to bless David and establish an eternal kingdom. A simple outline is first the genealogies in chapters 1 through 9. The book starts with the most extensive genealogical section found in Scriptures. They cover the entire range of Old Testament history, from Adam to the returned exiles after Babylonian captivity. This genealogy highlights the importance of Judah, the Davidic dynasty, and the centralized worship at Jerusalem set up by David. A noteworthy consideration is that this genealogy began at Adam, which indicates that the redemptive purpose of God didn't just include the Jewish people, but the whole human race. This is why it is important not to discount or skip the reading of genealogies. Try to look under the surface of all the names and determine why they were recorded. The second main section is found in chapters 10 through 21, and that's David's leadership. We move from the genealogy of David to an in-depth focus of David himself. We see the mighty men aligning themselves with David, the moving of the ark eventually to Jerusalem, the defeat of multiple nations under David, David's sin of ordering a census, to finally seeing David's plan to construct a temple, his organization of the temple, and then his death at the end of the book. In reading through this section, you will see David's heart of devotion to God. We know that this doesn't mean that he was perfect, but it does mean that he desired to please God and worship him. It was in his heart to build a temple for God, but God didn't allow him to build it. Rather, Solomon built the temple. David was God's favorite king, the head of Judah and the Messianic dynasty. This plays itself out as we read through the book. And the final section includes the preparation and organization of the temple in chapters 22 through 29. David moved the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, and he wanted to build the temple. Remember, the Ark of the Covenant and the temple represented the presence of God. It was built in Jerusalem, which was the capital and center of the land of Israel and Judah. It was where God dwelt and was the sole place of worship for Israel. The temple was to be built according to the pattern given by David. It was modeled after the tabernacle. The temple, again, was where God would dwell, but in Solomon's prayer in 2 Chronicles chapter 6, we learn the fact that God was greater than the temple, and he was not confined to it. But people would find God's presence there, and God would listen and respond to his people when they prayed towards the temple. Some things to consider when reading this book. First, what do we learn about worship? God prescribes how his people are to worship him. We don't decide how we want to worship God. We come to God on his terms. David's a great example of one who desired to worship God in a worthy manner. The Old Testament is replete with examples of how people chose to worship God on their terms, and it didn't end out very well at all. A second thing that we can consider, what do we learn about obedience? We see this concept in David's charge to his son Solomon in chapter 28. It says, "If you seek the Lord, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will reject you forever." This idea is repeated throughout 2 Chronicles. We see this truth played out in the downfall and the death of Saul. It's seen in the lives of Uzziah, Josiah, and Rehoboam. Another consideration, what do we learn about the heart? The word heart is mentioned about 850 times in the Old Testament. It occurs 63 times in the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Is this something to take note of? Well, I think so. The heart is closely linked to the principle of obedience. God wasn't asking for outward assent to his commands. He desires a willing heart, a submissive response to his commands. This is clearly seen in the life of Saul. Do you remember what Saul did in sparing the best of the animals when he was supposed to completely wipe out the Amalekites? 1 Samuel 15 verse 22 tells us to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. Finally, what do we learn about prayer? There are 5 major prayers recorded in both 1st and 2nd Chronicles. These prayers were made by the good kings of Israel that acknowledged and worshiped God. We see David's prayer in response to the covenant that God made to him in 1 Chronicles 17. We also see David's prayer of dedication as gifts were brought for the construction of the temple in 1 Chronicles 29. The other 3 prayers are found in 2 Chronicles, one by Solomon in dedication of the temple, one by Jehoshaphat when Israel was threatened by the Moabites, and one by Hezekiah over the improper cleansing during the Passover. Prayer is important. It was then, and it is now. As you read 1 Chronicles, I trust that you will be encouraged to see how God faithfully fulfills his promises and how he blesses obedience, and he always acts in justice.